right, good afternoon, everybody, and thanks for staying with us. I'm Liz Alderman, the Chief European Business Correspondent for the New York Times, and I'm excited to be hosting this panel on information wars, one of the most important topics that we're going to be discussing at this entire conference. We just heard my colleague David Sanger in Washington talking with Azim Azar about how technology can be used to find a way out of the problems that technology creates. And we heard mention during that discussion of the so-called Digital Geneva Convention, which are basically sort of a new set of rules that are being proposed to protect the public from the dangers of digital warfare and basically how companies can use governance. On this panel, we're going to be talking about how governments should be pushing companies, the role that government has in basically regulating social media companies as well as their users. And obviously, the platforms themselves have been taking a great deal of action to try and stamp out or mitigate hateful and insightful content that appears on them, but governments clearly have a bigger role to play. Despite all of the negative things that we hear about social media, technology can also play a positive role, and we want to talk about that on our panel as well. So I do want to keep the session interactive, so I would encourage all of you to submit questions during our discussion, but let me start by introducing our distinguished panelists. First, I want to issue a warm welcome to Orit Farkash-Hacohen from Israel, the Minister of Strategic Affairs. We have also Dan Shefet, an attorney at the Paris Court of Appeal, who has devoted his career really to working on human rights issues. And Wietse van Ransbeeck, you are the co-founder and chief executive of CitizenLab, and you create tools that promote more democratic dialogue on social media, which is incredibly important. Orit, thank you very much for joining us from afar. Let me start with you, if I could. As the Minister for Strategic Affairs in Israel, you obviously are grappling head-on with the question of how big of a role a government should be playing in regulating social media platforms and their users. Let me just start by asking you a kind of a general step-back question. In your view, is our biggest problem today that governments are doing too much oversight of technology or too little?
Shalom from Yerushalayim, from Jerusalem, and thank you for hosting me in that important issue and panel. Today, there is no doubt about the social media has become haven for fake news, for incitement, for hate speech, and we encounter that as many other countries around the world. For me, it's a second COVID-19, and in those days, the hate speech and the incitement online because of the general unrest is even larger and more dangerous. What happens, in my view, is that at the name or on behalf of freedom of speech, some groups of interest are making manipulation and misuse of the freedom of speech in order to spread hate news and violence around the social media networks. And that is something that every state cannot overlook. Let's talk, for example, about the New York Times. Why does traditional media needs to do 1,000 times fact check to be integrity and to be loyal to integrity in publication, and the social media giants don't do it? So the question regarding your question, I think that, of course, governments should deal with the matter and should address with the matter, as we know they are starting to. And my colleagues in the panel, as I understand, will illustrate about what's happening in Europe in different regulations that now are taking place. But it is, again, I think, too little. As a government, as a minister, I started a process of engagement with the social media networks in Israel. We are conducting a roundtable with the social media because I think that another very important point is that we can't do it alone. Only enforcement and regulation will not do the trick. You know, I'm a former regulation. This is something that is an adaptive change. The social media networks must understand that they have a power, and with power comes responsibility and accountability. And the fact is that at the end of the day, They have the power to control the minds and to corrupt the minds. And this cannot be overlooked. So my perspective is, and we're engaging with implementing a program of four steps with the social media giants. We want them to create relevant and clear policies. Today, most of their policies are unclear and being manipulated by the users and by hate speechers and by people who incite. They should enforce their policy without any double standard, and I will talk about it for a second. They should be transparent about the facts. Could you imagine that all social media giants do not publish how many complaints they are getting, how many content is being removed, how many complaints are being addressed, and what do they do with incitements and hate speech with labeling? Transparency is the first key for equal and enforcement and none of the double standard. And lastly, to remove problematic contract. Now, when I talk about double standard, I want to give you only one example. When we're talking about Twitter refusing for my approach about the leader of Iran, Khamenei, who is related to terror organization, tweeting for millions and millions of people about Israel, which is a Jewish state, the Jewish homeland of the Jewish people, calling it cancerous tumor that needs to be rooted out. You know, this is classic anti-Semitic rhetoric that was used against Jews. And Twitter says, no, this is freedom of speech, while at the same time label other leaders for talks and tweets talking about elections, for example. So this, in my view, is a totally double standard. And I think that incitement is incitement is incitement. And yet again, another example where they refuse to deal with the leaders that cross the red lines, that's a problem for me because they have more influence than younger people. So that is it, my 2 cents for that question. We all know that perception is being now set online. My young girl today who's taking the Zoom classes in Zoom is more affected by social media than her teachers. So with responsibility comes with the power should come the responsibility, and it cannot be a unilateral effort of the governments. It should be dealt with an engagement process with the social media platforms, and that should take place, you know, as quickly as possible.
That's incredibly interesting. And Dan, let me throw this open to you because this is exactly the type of thing that you deal with. And what the minister just said about, you know, with power comes responsibility. You know, governments have been pressuring, have been putting the screws down on social media to take action, but oftentimes it's not necessarily terribly effective, or the outcome is not one necessarily that political leaders or governments are that happy with. You've studied the efforts that have been undertaken in Germany and France to tackle this. Tell us about what those efforts are, and in your view, are they effective? And if not, why not?
Okay, well, let's just get back first to the basis of regulation from a legal point of view. The basis of regulation and accountability, we have two internationally very different and distinct theories. One is the US, which is based on the Communications Decency Act from 1996, and the other is the European E-Commerce Directive from year 2000. The way that we may simplify that difference, which is important to answer your question, is that in the US, the tech platforms, that is search engines, that is social media, etc., enjoy absolute immunity. In other words, they cannot be held accountable from a legal point of view for third-party generated content. Because as the minister just mentioned, most of what we see, almost everything we see on Twitter, etc., is not generated by Twitter. Actually, none of it is. It is generated by third parties. So the question is, to what extent may Twitter, as an example, be accountable for what third parties do with that technology? In the US, the decision was taken, as I mentioned, in 1996, to say complete immunity. Twitter, in this specific case, cannot be held liable. There have been numerous cases, even involving terrorist content, where the Communications Decency Act has shielded Twitter from immunity. The European approach is what I call relative immunity, which is based on the on the e-commerce directive 4 years later, year 2000, which is really based on the standard of actual knowledge. In other words, if we take the example of Twitter, it's not that Twitter is the only platform, but since this is the one that we're talking about right now, they would be accountable as of the moment when they gained actual knowledge of the hurtful content in question. Now, both of these laws, both the Communications Decency Act in the US and the e-commerce directive in Europe, are now being revisited. The Department of Justice in the US is revisiting, very much inspired by Trump's executive order against Twitter, the Communications Decency Act, and the European Commission is revisiting the e-commerce directive. They want to come out with the Digital Services Act. We'll probably see that by the end of the year, by early next year. So all regulation that wants to hold social media accountable needs to comply with these two basic laws. In Europe, now to get to your question, we've dealt with the problem. The first country really to deal with the problem within the limits of the e-commerce directive was Germany. Germany's Netzdurchgesetz law took effect on the 1st of January 2018. It's also called the hate speech law. And the French so-called loi Avia, which actually passed Parliament on the 18th of May, was censored by our Conseil Constitutionnel, which is more or less the equivalent to a constitutional court, on the 18th of June. It was almost struck down entirely, and it's therefore extremely interesting to see how come that the German law survives constitutional scrutiny and the French did not, because both of them are based on the e-commerce directive. The interesting thing is that the German approach is systemic. In other words, the basis for holding Twitter or Facebook or whoever accountable for third-party generated content would be failure to put in place a system which would allow these platforms, one, to preemptively detect, and two, when they acquired actual knowledge, to act. If the social media have put in place such a systemic oversight system, to a certain extent employing artificial intelligence, they cannot be held accountable for specific content that slips through the system. If, on the other hand, they have not put in place this system, then they may be accountable. The fines go up to 50 million euros. So far, only one fine has been handed down, and that was to the tune of 1 million euros, and it was for failure to be transparent.
Well, is that system effective at all? Because we hear Facebook saying, for example, they've hired 35,000 people in countries around the world to monitor undesirable and insightful content. So, we heard the minister just give an example where, in her view, that is not enough. What has been the case in Germany and France?
It's an extremely complicated question because let's just contrast that with the French version, and then I'll get back to your question. Because the French loi Avia, as I mentioned, was struck down by the equivalent to the Constitutional Court for infringing free speech, Article 19 of the International Civil and Political Rights and of the Declaration of Human Rights. Because that law was based really on failure to act on specific content. The German law would, in your specific case, most probably shield the platforms if they had put in place a proportionate number of fact-checkers, and if they have, as I mentioned before, employed the necessary artificial intelligence and so on to preemptively intercept. There is also an additional requirement, and that is detecting virality. In other words, artificially creating virality through bots is something that should attract attention through the system to be put in place. So even if it is not 100% efficient, and it certainly isn't, the good faith attempt to put in place a system to detect it would shield. And in my opinion, that is really the only way that we can proceed. We cannot hold these social media accountable for third-party content, for the content for the specific content, if they have done whatever they could to avoid it. How do you want to hold anybody accountable for that? It really doesn't make sense from a legal point of view. And that is also why the French law was struck down. It simply went too far. It was content-oriented and not system-oriented.
I want. That's a really interesting point that I want to bring the discussion back around to that in just a moment. But this is a good opening to bounce over to you, Wietse, because your company is all about sort of creating tools that hopefully could sort of, help mitigate this. In other words, alternative means for there to be a more sort of constructive dialogue among people. Can you talk to us about what some of those tools would be, and what's to say that those tools themselves couldn't wind up being used in the same way that all other social media platforms are by people who want to express, people who do express sort of extremist perspectives and perhaps want to incite others to action?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Well, first of all, maybe introducing a bit what kind of tools we provide. So we provide a digital democracy platform. There are, of course, many other tools or other platforms available. But what we do is we help citizens have a say in local policymaking within the projects of the government, but also more from the bottom up, that citizens can bring up their proposals. What's different compared to social media is that it actually starts from a broader question: how are we going to constitute the public sphere in the digital era? And social media are not a means to have a constructive debate. We all know about filter bubbles on social media networks, the echo chambers. So I think it's also the responsibility of the governments to rethink how are we going to create that digital democracy. And then such platforms can be interesting because those platforms are owned by the government. They are the data owner. So when it comes to manipulation, the minister was talking about it, the government is in control. They can also, when they procure those platforms, they can design the platforms in the way that some democratic values are safeguarded, in the sense that when we talk about transparency and openness, they can procure open source platforms and make sure that the algorithms are open and transparent, but at the same time that when artificial intelligence is used, that it's explained to the citizens in what way it is used. So I believe that probably, and the most important aspect is that those platforms, they can constitute a space where you have citizens from different backgrounds to deliberate and to have conversations with each other. And that is essential for democracy in the digital age, that we're not only talking to people like us, but that we can have conversation with also people who have different opinions and can come to a consensus together.
Do you think that there is a desire among citizens to be able to return to that type of dialogue? I mean, Tom Friedman, in his most recent op-ed piece, wrote that Facebook and Twitter have become huge unedited cesspools of conspiracy theories that in turn destroy our ability to sort truth from falsehood. There might be these alternative tools, but again, what if people were to sort of, just keep on using them in ways that are meant to promote their own agenda?
Yeah, sure. From our own experience, what we see is that the fact that it's a government platform where you also show your identity, just as we're having a face-to-face conversation and we can see each other, that already makes a huge difference. It's, that within the community, the other people talking on those platforms are citizens who have, in a way, maybe verified their identity. So I think that is important on social media. You can create as many accounts as you want, and it's so easy to troll around. And you can actually design those platforms in such a way that you also prevent that mechanism.
Madam Minister, is that type of tool something that you would see as useful or desirable from your perspective, or would something like that be enough to kind of prevent the Wild West that Twitter and Facebook can be sometimes from overrunning, I guess, a broader discussion of democracy?
I heard both my colleagues in this panel, and I truly think that it is not a question of ability, it's a question of will. I think that the social media giants have the technology to do whatever they wish to do. Look, for example, at pornography on the web. There is no sight of it on Facebook, and it is, of course, a very important thing. Why? Because Facebook put a target to eliminate this phenomenon on its platforms. So, you know, I'm a former regulator. I was a regulator of the infrastructure of the energy market in Israel. And I think that this is the most complicated area. I think that regular regulation, informal fines, and punishments will not be enough. I think that this is something a little bit in the middle between self-regulation and commitments that these companies must take upon themselves to put the resources. They know how to do it if they only decide to do it just as much as they are committed to their profits. Just like the New York Times, just like every traditional platform, just like every entity in this world is committed to integrity, they should do the same. I think that the major problem we're facing today of fake news, of incitement, this is not something that is, you know, theoretic. These actions lead for proven violence, and that is the problem. And in that sense, I want to suggest a change of thought. We know the world in the old order. We know the traditional nations and states. The social platforms today are like the new nations. Their users are bigger than every other nation that we know. And so just as the nations are responsible for their citizens, the social media should be. I do agree with the words that were said here, that there should be a different regard regarding a platform that put mechanism in place and another one that was reckless about it and didn't even try. But we are not even there yet. The enforcement is totally double standards. It is totally random-like. When do they decide to label? When they don't? And again, I want to put something on the table. We are not calling for a removal of every remark and every wording. But you know, labeling, for example, can be used much more, especially with leaders, with links saying, for the true fact, go here, do that. This is totally doable. And if they have all these resources to be that profitable in amounts and in percentage that cannot, you know, that they are record-breaking in that area, they should put enough resources and the highest technology to just get to the target of zero tolerance to the incitement and fake news on the news. And I want to say it again, and I want to say again my message. This is something that is incremental to the next generation, to the younger people, to our faces as a society. I think that if these things will not be dealt with and addressed as quickly as possible, it will have immense influence on our society, and not in a good way. And in that sense, I think that yes, regulation should be put in place, but it will not be enough, because money consideration cannot deal with this question of values. There are so many platforms that will be just oblivious, and they will say, we will pay the fines and we will keep doing what we are doing. Another thing that I want to say is that this should be something that should take into consideration the partnership between the nation. I think that the fact that Germany has its own regulation and Great Britain has its own ideas, and I, for myself, doing my own engagement is not enough. This is something that should be dealt together and should be addressed with those social giants, media, actually for their convenience, because it is also not fair that every country would come with a different model. I think that the focus should be on the result, and I think that the result should be given to these companies very clear and crystal clear. The result we wanna get is zero tolerance for incitement, for violence, and it can be on a range of tools, from labeling to removal. Once you do this kind of regulation that is based on the result and not on the punishments and so on, and once the government are working together, then we have a chance. And building on what you asked me before, I just want to give you a little example why the countries cannot avoid this problem. We did a little experience in my ministry. We issued a complaint to one of the social platforms on a double route. One was put by one of my employees as a simple citizen, as one was put on behalf of me as a minister and as a state. It is clear, it is not surprising that the social media returned to me within hours, while to the citizen it took days. Mm-hmm. So these are my 2 cents. I think it's not a question of ability, it's a question of a will, and I think it's an adaptive change that the society should take together with these companies. It is not something technical.
Dan, I would love for you to respond to what the minister just said. And as soon as you do, I then want to turn to, because we're getting some questions in from our viewers. So Dan, a kind of a brief response to how feasible is all that?
I'll try to be brief. There were some very interesting points that were raised. Let's start with the sort of nationwide responsibility and also international regulation, putting at the same, or coordinating national and domestic, just like the French and the German laws. Nothing is new under the sun, and we shouldn't forget that actually during the time of the League of Nations, there was a conference in 1933, which ended up in a treaty in 1936, dealing with moral disarmament. Those were the words used at that time. Mm-hmm. And that treaty, which is actually still in effect, imposes upon the members, of course the US was not a member, as we know, of the League of Nations, but of the member states to police, on the basis of country of origin, propaganda is what it was called in those days, and again, moral disarmament. It was an example of an international attempt precisely to do away with hurtful information which was intended to destabilize your neighbor. Unfortunately, it didn't help create the biggest propaganda machine, which we very well know was Goebbels' machine some years later. But it was at least an attempt, and we could learn a lot from going back and seeing what they discussed at the League of Nations times in the 1933 to 1936 period. So I agree that it would be interesting to see whether we could revisit some sort of treaty, because the problem is that even if 193 out of the 194 or 95 member states of the United Nations would agree on a treaty, there will be one or two that wouldn't, and they would be safe havens for immunity, which would therefore defeat, given the universality of social media, the whole purpose. So that's kind of my take on international regulation. The second thing is that you also mentioned that social media do not, I think you implied that they do not comply with human rights. At least that is the legal implication of what you said. And I totally agree that unfortunately human rights only obligate states, as we all know. They do not obligate private individuals or corporations. Now that is a major mistake. These companies have legal personhood. They are protected by both the Bill of Rights in the US and by international human rights treaties, but they are not obligated by them. So that's also something that we may want to move on from an international perspective. The last thing was your first point in terms of comparing hate speech and incitement to pornography. I'm sorry, I don't agree with the comparison, even apart from the fact that pornography is highly debatable in specific cases. I've had the opportunity of following almost all the cases before the International Criminal Court, the Special Tribunal on Rwanda, the Special Tribunal on Yugoslavia, and even the Nuremberg trials dealing with incitement. And I can tell you that it is extremely difficult, even for the most trained judges, international judges in the world, to decide whether something is illicit speech or not. There are many, many cases from these high-level courts where somebody is either acquitted or convicted at the first level, and that decision is overturned on appeal. In other words, it's extremely difficult. And I don't see how we can oblige social media to be more clever than professional judges in terms of defining whether something is illicit speech or not, given, of course, that once we do that, we mathematically restrict not only free speech, but we also impose upon these organizations accountability sanctions which are not related to knowledge. And that, to me, is not possible from a legal point of view.
Well, that still leaves us with a huge social dilemma, as it were. And there's a lot more that we could say about that, but let me just, since we have a little bit less than 5 minutes left, throw it open to this, to one of the questions from the audience. This is a question from the students from students from the Global Liberal Arts Alliance. They're asking, the amount of information produced by social media users is staggering and is only going to increase in the coming years. Even if controls on social media could be agreed upon, how enforceable could any restrictions be? And where would the limit to the amount of information, where would be the limit to the amount of information that would need to be processed to enforce them? Wietse, do you want to take that on quickly and we can go around and have a response from everybody?
I think I will leave that one to, as I'm not a social media expert, I think I will leave that one to the other panelists.
Yeah.
My specific proposal for that would be to replace penal sanctions by specific class action remedy. Class action like we have it in the US, which we do not have in Europe, which will allow civil citizens, and there are cases, and I mentioned the Twitter case, and I'm sure the minister knows very well about a case involving the families of 1,000 victims of terrorist attacks in Israel. Unfortunately, that case against one big social media giant was thrown out of court because it didn't pass the test of the Communications Decency Act, as I just said. But we having hopefully revisited that immunity shield, and I would suggest that, I would recommend, and I also did that to the European Commission, that we create a special class action suit in Europe, which will allow victims, either individuals or groups, just like class actions in the US, properly certified, to take legal action against these companies and obtain punitive damages.
Madam Minister, in the 2 minutes that we have left or so, was it, I mean, in your view, would that be an adequate solution or not?
No, I don't think it's an enough solution. I do understand it is complicated. I also agree with what was said here, that there would be many cases of a borderline. But you know what? Once we will have that problem, we will be in a good shape. We are not there yet. There are so many incidents where the red lines that were crossed are crystal clear and are not being dealt with. Whenever you do a material change of concept of behavior, you start somewhere. We have such a long way to go that, you know, I even wish that we would come to these very controversial and borderline cases that my colleague is talking about. And when the question by the students, what should be the limit? I think that we really should start where the red lines or the red, where the black flag is raised up on that. When I see a German celebrity on Telegram doing a poll asking who financed the Holocaust, with thousands of people participating in these polls, and one of the answers is the Zionists. So I think there is a red flag here. And I do agree that there will be borderline cases that won't be able to say, is that incitement, is that not incitement? When somebody says, a leader of a state, take your guns and kill Belgium, for example, kill every Belgian that you see. This is not a borderline case, and this should not get the shield or the immunity by the social platform on the basis that it's a political leader. So my answer in a nutshell is that, first of all, let's use our common sense. It is still there. We know when enough is enough. Let's deal with the core cases that are totally undealt with, and totally, like you says, it's like a haven of incitements and fake news, and it's a crazy jungle, and we don't want to be there. So let's define internationally the red lines and the borders and the core essence that we know that we want to deal with. Let's start step by step. with labeling, with removing, with transparency. Every big change starts with a small step. And it's about time to start doing it.
Absolutely. Well, thank you all very much for being with us. We could have used a lot more time to talk about this, but very much appreciate all of the solutions that you are trying to bring to the table. Let's take a break now, and during this break, please enjoy one of our best panel discussions from yesterday. Thank you once again to all of our panelists for being here, and let's hope that we'll see a brighter future.
Totally agree.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.